Hey everybody, it's Conrad here, with the third in a series of sermons about the church, but based in Acts. We're asking the question, what kind of church were they, and what kind of activity did they do, with the hope that we can judge from that better what kind of church we should be, and what kinds of activities we should be involved in. This week we're looking at Acts chapter 5, which involves the church in persecution in an era of opposition. It's a bit too much text to read at once, so in chapel I've asked for an abridged reading that zips through it. And there are side stories as well, and someday I'd love to tell you about the Sadducees at the start and the Pharisees near the end, but there isn't time for that today. Instead, let me take you through the story beat by beat. The first thing that happens is that jealousy on the part of the Jewish leaders, especially the Sadducees, leads to the arrest of the disciples. But it doesn't end there because the apostles are freed by an angel. So when folks come to look for them in the jail the next morning, they're not there and there are no-shows at their court case. But eventually they're found and rearrested. And then in the middle of a meeting that seems determined to have them killed, a Pharisee named Gamaliel stands up and calms the whole assembly down. As a result, eventually, the apostles are released. And that's sort of what happens in the story. When you look at that, it doesn't really tell us a lot about the church's activity. It's a lot of stuff that happens to the church. They were arrested, they were freed, they were no-shows, they were rearrested. Gamaliel has nothing to do directly with their actions, and eventually they're released. There are a lot of verbs, there are a lot of actions in this passage. I've colored them all in blue here, but they're different kinds of verbs, and as I've hinted, not all of them are directly relevant to what kind of church, what activities of the church. So the first thing that we see, of course, at the top is crowds gathered from towns around Jerusalem. That's not telling us anything about our activities. Similarly, later in the paragraph, the Sadducees were filled with jealousy. There are lots of verbs in this passage that aren't directly about the church and about its actions. But there are some things that the church does. At daybreak, they entered the temple. There's a clear action that the church does. So I think we should highlight those in red. At daybreak, they entered the temple and they began to teach the people. There are verbs like that that are what the church actually does. There are also things that are specifically about what happens to the church, things done to the church. And those are of interest as well. So I'm going to color those orange. The apostles were arrested and they were put in jail. The doors of the jail opened and the angel brought them out. Passive things that happen to the church are in orange. But there's also a specific kind of verb, commands, that the church is given. These aren't just things that are in the vocative, but commands. And these I've highlighted in green. Go, stand, tell, says the angel. Those are things you have to do. And they entered the temple, action, as they had been told, which is about the command. So when we carry this color pattern out through the whole of the passage, we get something that looks kind of like this. Let's get rid of the ones that aren't directly relevant, shall we? The blue ones, and just look at the actives and the passives and the commands. There's something like this. It's still rather cluttered. I'm not seeing a clear pattern yet. We'll get rid of the passives, but before we do, I want to talk about them because here's the first of 3 surprises that I'm going to talk to you about. 3 surprises. And that is that the church is brought here and put there, put in a public jail, brought them out, they sent to the jail. They brought the apostles, they brought them into the Sanhedrin and made them to appear before the Sanhedrin. And then they were put outside, and then they were called back in. The church is told to go here, go there, go somewhere else. And they go. They go where they're told, whether it's by an angel who brings them out of the jail, or by guards who put them in the jail, or send them out of the assembly, or bring them back into the assembly. The church goes where it's told to go, with the irony, of course, that at the very end, as you'll see at the bottom, the advice of the assembly is, you know what, we just need to let them go. Go here, go there, and then just let them go. It's sort of ironic and funny, and even funnier, I think, is this passage up here. In verse 24, the captain of the temple guard and the chief priests were at a loss, wondering where this might lead to. I think I would have been tempted to translate this, not knowing where all this was going. Go here, go there, and surprisingly, the church passively goes. And the end of all that is not that the opponents think that they can send them anywhere they want, but that they agree to let them go. And they have to confess they don't know where all this is going. I just think that's kind of fun. Anyway, so much for the passives. If we get rid of the passives, if we get rid of all the orange stuff, are there any patterns left with just the red and the green? It turns out there are. And if you think about it, this isn't surprising. Because what we've got left are commands and actions. And it's not surprising that those two things go together. So here's a case at the very beginning where there are some commands in green and then actions that sort of mixed in and result from those commands. There's another block here of commands and actions. And then finally down at the bottom, there's a third block there. So there are 3 blocks of commands and actions. There look to be some actions on their own without commands here, but you'll see in a minute when we look at this block that those actions actually belong part of this story with the commands, and they're actually fulfilling those commands. We'll look at that in a second. Let's look at that. There's 3 blocks. I've colored them blue and orange and yellow. Let's look first at the first block, which is the least surprising of the blocks. We learned something pretty obvious about what kind of church and what kind of activity. The church is told by God through an angel, given 3 commands. Go, stand, and tell. And not surprisingly, the church goes. They enter the temple in verse 21. The church is told to stand in verse 20, and they are found standing. Look down at the bottom of the screen. The men you put in jail are standing in the temple. Go, stand, and then finally tell. And in both verse 21 and in verse 25, we see the apostles teaching the people. So we learned something pretty obvious that we almost didn't need the text to tell us. What kind of church? A church that is obedient to God and his commands through this angel. And what kinds of activities to go, to stand, and to tell. That's a great sermon in itself, but fairly obvious. We follow God's orders of go, stand, and tell. The second block of our 3, though, is very different. If the first block was about what kind of church, an obedient church, and the second, and the activities were go, stand, and tell, here we see a church given the order, don't teach, don't tell, given to it by human beings rather than by an angel, by God. To this command, of course, the church is disobedient. They're told not to teach. And then I think it's kind of funny that the next thing that happens is Peter and the apostles try to teach the Sanhedrin why they're not going to reply, why they're not going to obey. They reply We must obey God rather than human beings. The character of the reply now is defiance and disobedience. But here's the second surprise, and this is really important and something I think we need to learn from because it's not quite as obvious as the lessons of the first block. Their tone, their character, and the content differ from one another. The content is, we are not going to obey you. But that's not actually the tone and the character of what Peter says. How can I say this? Their defiance is not based on the human command being wrong. And that's not what the reply is about. You guys are wrong. The reply rather is about our prior commitment. We must obey God. This is a subtle difference, but it's a really important one to our attitude when we're disobeying. Because it's not really that we're disobeying them. It's that we have a prior commitment and a higher obedience. It's not about what they're doing wrong. It's a reassertion of what God wants. We must obey God. Now there is a whiff of arguing against the opponents, you might think, in the way that Peter says you killed him by hanging him on a cross in verse 31. But as you see in verse 28 up here, the Sanhedrin brings this up first. You are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. I put this in red because this looks like an activity of the church. You've filled Jerusalem with your teaching, that's they've done, and you're determined to make us... Well, no, though. That's not actually true. That's not actually what the church is determined to do. The church is not determined to overthrow the Jews and their opponents. The Sanhedrin here are trying to cast the apostles in the role of accusers, in the role of prosecution, which is, again, ironic within the context of what's going on in the scene, which is the apostles being on trial and the Sanhedrin being the prosecution. They're still trying to cast the apostles in the role of accusers. Are the church accusers? Should the church be a prosecution? Should the church be debaters? I think this is a wrong accusation. I think rather than being the prosecution in the courtroom, Peter clearly takes them back and says, no, we're neither the prosecution nor the defense. We are witnesses of these things. We are witnesses. And this, I almost need a different color than red highlighting for this, because this isn't about action. This is about identity. Not we are witnessing to these things, but we are witnesses. That makes it a really important and special verb within this context. What kind of church? Is it a disobedient church? Not exactly. It's a church that looks disobedient because it's obedient to a higher calling. What kind of church? A witnessing church. And what kind of activities? Well, the activities are replying, which is another kind of telling and explaining, replying and witnessing. That's the teaching of block 2. The third block is also about human orders. The third block I've colored yellow, and strangely, even though we saw in the last block, the previous order of don't tell was completely unsuccessful, but the Sanhedrin tried here again, not having learned their lesson. Gamaliel, the Pharisee, in the previous long paragraph advised letting them go. The Sanhedrin calls them in and has them flogged first. I got rid of the passives, so that's not highlighted in orange, but in verse 40, they had them flogged. And then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus. That's not going to work. It's our duty to be disobedient to that. Look at the active verbs. They left, let them go, and they left. But they were rejoicing. Now, here's surprise number 3, and maybe the biggest surprise of all, and the most important surprise of all. They were not rejoicing at their success. They were not rejoicing in regaining their freedom. They were not even rejoicing at having stood. Go, stand, tell. We did that. We didn't cave in. Let's rejoice in that. No. They were rejoicing about their suffering for Jesus rather than rejoicing in their success. This is a huge surprise to the world. This is a surprise that Peter learned when Jesus told him he was going to die. And Jesus said, no way, Jesus, you're going to be successful. Think positive. And Jesus said, yeah, get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking like God. You're thinking like human beings. I'm afraid I think even that great Tony Campolo's sermon of it's Friday, but Sunday is coming, is thinking like a human rather than thinking like God, looking to the victory to rejoice in. Peter learned the lesson and rejoices in the suffering rather than the being set free. And the church learned to call the Friday Good Friday rather than the Sunday Good Sunday. We rejoice in suffering. We rejoice in, well, not the suffering exactly. We rejoice for being counted worthy of suffering. We rejoice in our being belonging to God and being His. But then, we're back to the go, stand, and tell. After the rejoice, we're back to the teaching and proclaiming. They never stopped teaching and proclaiming. So, what kind of church, what kind of activities? In this passage, there's a whole bunch of verbs. And they're consistent with previous weeks. Telling and teaching is in the mix over and over again, like explaining that we talked about the other weeks. And we also talked about worshiping, and although worship isn't there exactly, rejoicing is. The verbs sort of shake out into these 3 clumps for the church in persecution. Go and stand, tell, teach, proclaim, witness. And we should rejoice, not in our victories, but in our weakness. There will always be people opposed to what we're called to, but our response should be measured and nuanced. It's not our job to convince them. It's not our job to take them down. We can try to convince them. We do reply, even when we're told not to reply, not to teach anymore. Peter replied, but we're not prosecutors. We're not debaters. We are witnesses. They tell you to go here, to go there, and you go with them. It's when they tell you what not to do what God has called you to. Then you have to politely disobey. You don't make a big deal of it, but what kind of church? An obedient church, but also an apparently disobedient church. When they say go, go. When they say stop, don't stop. Never stop. Never stop rejoicing, pray without ceasing, never stop explaining, never stop being a witness. What kind of church? What kind of activity? A rejoicing, worshiping church that never stops being a witness to the truth. Thank you.